Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this invite. It's really exciting to be here and connect with a whole group of environmental scientists. A little backstory, I was just saying in the breakout room is that I was very close to doing environmental science and was debating that between psychology, and in the end decided to go down a psychology route. But the entire time I've been studying, I've been wondering, should I have really done environmental science, because I felt like I wasn't making enough impact on the environment. But hopefully now with this new project, I feel like actually we can start to merge my two interests and have some impact. So before I tell you about Open Heart and Mind, which is my latest open science project, I thought I'd give you a bit of a backstory on who I am and where I've come from, so you can understand the context of this project. Oh, it's not going, there we go. So my journey into academia really began with a Vipassana retreat, weirdly, where I discovered the previously unexplored depths of my own mind and became fascinated with this idea of exploring consciousness from all possible angles. So this led me to return home to Brisbane to study an undergrad in psychology. And I finished honours and then followed that up with a PhD in the cognitive neuromechanisms of consciousness at the Queensland Brain Institute. And through these long and sometimes difficult 5 years, I published, I think, 4 papers. The first of which was really an eye-opener into the academic system, because it took 2 years to publish this paper, during which time it was bounced from 5 journals before it finally found a home, went through multiple rounds of review, and the entire time I just found myself wondering why it was taking so long to tell people about the thing that I'd done. I just wanted to move on and keep doing science. And at the same time, as well as this inefficiency in the system, I also became really concerned about this pressure that I felt on myself to act in less than ideal ways. And so there's lots of initiatives. People have talked about this for a very long time. There's very unhealthy incentives in the way we publish, because journals tend to prioritize novelty and significance at the expense of reliability. And this left me questioning my future in academia. I became very disillusioned with the whole process. And ultimately, this combined with some other life stresses threw me into a really deep depression that lasted a couple of years. And coming out of that was really thanks to 2 main things. One was starting to take better care of myself, in particular adopting practices like self-compassion meditation, gratitude, and play, which is something that I'd completely forgotten to do in my task-focused, regimented life of my PhD. But then the other thing that really helped pull me out of my depression was discovering hope in the open science movement. So this is the movement that aims to make all scientific knowledge freely available to the general public. And I recognized what I thought was a need in this space, which was a lack of collective action mechanisms. So I founded this project called Free Our Knowledge, which you can kind of think of as a Kickstarter for behavioral change in academia. The basic premise is that anyone could create a campaign asking their peers to adopt some action, like publishing in open access journals, sharing data, you name it, and then set a threshold at which action would be taken. And so the idea is that you don't have to take action alone, because that comes with certain career risks. But if you could take action alongside, some critical mass of your colleagues, then that would protect you from whatever risks you might otherwise be facing. So for about 3 years now, I've been developing that project, and it's now is actually beginning to pick up steam. And I've been presenting that around the world at various conferences and so forth for the last few years. But I also felt like the rate of change for that project is too slow. Like, I think probably in 10 years, it could really build a critical mass and actually start to affect the system. But I'm interested in trying to create change much quicker than that. And so when I graduated in 2020, I took a number of entrepreneurship courses. I kept publishing on open science now, and I joined IGDORE, which is an independent institute for independent researchers. And I also completed what's called the Open Life Science Leaders Program, which is basically a crash course in how to set up and organize an open source project for maximum collaboration in the community. And so to fund myself in this new life, I started playing poker a bit more seriously than I was during my PhD. In 2021, I won a pretty decent sized high roller event and have been doing well since. So this has become my funding mechanism. And to be honest, I started pursuing this because I spent about a year applying for grants for free our knowledge, and I just couldn't get anywhere. And I found that I was spending so much time that I'd actually, ironically, be more successful just by playing poker than I would by gambling with the academic grant system. And so alongside this, I've been developing this model for a novel community-based publishing model that I think could play some role in disrupting the journal system that we all remain trapped to, even though it's the year 2022 and we've had the internet for 3 decades or more. But I'm not going to focus on that project too much, because even just in the last few months, my thinking and project has pivoted in an exciting new direction. And so I wanted to bring you all into that new vision, which I think eventually will feed back into this disruptive publishing model, but for now is taking a new direction. And so that project is called Open Heart and Mind. And yeah, so the main question that I'm trying to address in all of my projects, but particularly in Heart and Mind, is, or the main problem, I guess, is misinformation. Personally, I believe that all of the main problems that we see in the world today are at the foundation a misinformation problem. So we have a lot of confusion around COVID, whether vaccines are good or bad. We have a lot of political polarization. And for decades now, we haven't been making the progress that we really need to be making on climate change. And to me, this is because the general public typically get their information from incredibly biased information systems like Google, Facebook, YouTube, even like traditional mainstream media. All of these are biased in various ways. In particular, they tend to be biased towards generating profits for like advertising outlets, rather than delivering reliable information. And this really, to me, the main reason this is a problem is because we don't have a fundamentally open academic system. Right now, the information that the average person receives is very, very separated from what we're actually doing in science. And this primarily is because the information that we create is not accessible to the general public. So it's been recognized that there's at least 4 major crises in academia today. The first is access, and this is, for those of you who don't know, basically the fact that 70% of the literature that we publish is put behind paywalls that are owned by these private publishing corporations, and then leased back to academics. So we can access this information because we go to UQ and we own quite a privileged space, but for the vast majority of people around the world, they can't access this information without paying prohibitively expensive fees. And this means that they don't have access to the information they need to actually understand problems. Now, coupled with this is that we have what's known as the replication crisis. And this is saying that over half of the research findings that we publish are actually false positives. And this is underlying a massive, a rising level of distrust in science in the general public. And it just means that we can't make as fast progress as we otherwise might, because we don't even know what ground truth is at this point. The third crisis is known as the serials crisis, and this is basically pointing to the fact that over the last 5 decades or so, private publishers, which control the vast majority of the literature, have been jacking up subscription prices to their journals, I think 260% beyond the rate of inflation. And ultimately what this means is that large sums of money are being extracted from the research sector and going into private shareholders' pockets. And to me, that's money that really should just be going towards these really critical problems that we're facing as a global society. And when you put it in the context of Elsevier and other leading publishers making 35% profit margins every year, this makes scholarly publishing one of, if not the most profitable industries on earth, well exceeding the profits that companies like Google and Apple make in the region of like 20%. And finally, something that's probably close to all of our hearts is this evaluation crisis, the fact that we're being judged based on the prestige of the journal in which we publish, rather than the actual quality of the research that we do. And to me, when you look at this sort of global state that we're in, each of these major crises can be underpinned by the problem that we have with journals, because it's, like I said, 30 years since the internet's been developed, but yet we're still using this pre-internet model to share and communicate information. Instead, we could be using like an open source for science type model, but as yet, we haven't managed to get rid of this or overcome this journal addiction. And I just put this quote here to sort of highlight that this is, although we might think that disruption is just around the corner, Forbes thought that in 1995 when they said that Elsevier will be the internet's first victim. And obviously 25 or 27 years later, Elsevier and other publishers have actually increased their market share of the scholarly publishing market space. And so what this says to me is, and also through my work over the last few years, trying to pitch these ideas and get communities to experiment with new models, what it's saying is that academia is too constrained to experiment with new models, quite ironically, I think. There have been plenty of attempts to introduce new models, new ways of doing things, moving beyond the journal model, but unfortunately none of them have really taken hold yet. And just to take one example, I absolutely love pre-review. What it is a journal-free way that anyone in the world can review any preprint using a number of metrics and can generate community. It's really a really awesome tool. But to put things in context, it was launched in combination with outbreak science at the beginning of the pandemic. So it was targeting the pandemic community. And unfortunately, since over the course of the pandemic has only received in the region of hundreds of reviews. And we're talking like a drop in the ocean of the literature that could be reviewed on that topic. And so I think as an example of how constrained we are in academia, I think pre-review shows that really we need to be thinking outside the box of the traditional journal model and think about other ways that we can try and disrupt the system. And so this brings me to Heart and Mind and what we're trying to do there. And the main dream, I guess, is that if you imagine if we could track all of the contributions that someone might make to science, and then also as a community, amongst ourselves, determine the relative value of those contributions. So I'm talking articles, but not just articles like the current system is geared towards. I'm also talking about data, ideas, work, individual tasks. It might be data that people have collected. It might be an incidental comment that changes the direction of your PhD. All of these things are valuable contributions to the scientific effort and could, in theory, be tracked and valued by the community. And so right now, there's two main obstacles to this vision coming true. One is that value in the scientific enterprise is typically exchanged across multiple platforms. So probably many of you use things like Google Docs, Slack, GitHub, Trello, and so forth. And what that means is that by using all of these scattered platforms, it's very difficult to keep track of all of the value that gets exchanged, which is step one towards tracking and valuing contributions. And step two, the second main problem is that we don't really have a reliable tool to estimate the crowd value or the crowd valuation of different contributions. So yes, we do have things like Amazon and eBay where people can provide ratings and crowdsource feedback, but those are absolutely open to manipulation and bias. And so what we'd be looking for here is something that's a bit more rigorous, a lot more rigorous, and open to research so that it can improve over time. And from the open science space, like from the Open Life Science Leaders course, for example, I was taught how to use GitHub as the backend for a project. And GitHub is amazing for many, many things. Like it's really good for being a central store of value. So you can store documents in there, you can store code and so forth. And it also is really great at being a record of the changes that have been made over time through GitHub commits. And also people have used like various plugins to give people badges for contributions to projects. But unfortunately, none of these methods that have been developed give an accurate measure of the relative quality of these contributions. And to me, this isn't a barrier to effective collaboration, because when you're considering beginning a collaboration, you have to have some level of trust that the other person is going to reciprocate or reward your contributions fairly. And without that level of trust, which typically requires knowing the person, it can be a barrier to wanting to get involved and collaborate. But on the other hand, if you had this sort of pre-existing rule set and data that you could see, oh, this is how contributions get rewarded, then that would decrease that trust problem and incentivize collaboration with people, knowing that the effort that you put in would be fairly valued. And so to step outside of academia just for a minute, this problem is not at all specific to science. And in fact, I think it also taps into two competing streams of how you might manage an organization. So these are typically top-down hierarchical management of a project versus bottom-up management. And we know, from millennia that top-down organization is not very efficient. It's got bottlenecks at every level of the hierarchy. And there's obviously only so much that one manager can see. And so that means that some people get unfairly rewarded, other people can slack off, and so forth. And more recently, so since the advent of the internet, we've seen like an increase of these bottom-up organization structures, many of which use something like GitHub to try and organize the project. And this can be more democratic because it gives everyone an opportunity to post issues, solve problems in their own way. But typically it lacks this top-down control, which can actually be really important and necessary for driving a project forward. And so what I'm proposing we're building here is a tool that can help communities track, recognize, and reward valuable contributions to any collective effort. And so the first problem that I mentioned before about tracking value has actually already been solved. So if you haven't heard of it already, there's a really cool platform called ClickUp. There's actually a number of other platforms that are similar, like Notion, but I really like ClickUp because it's got a task-based structure, which means that basically every task that you do can be recorded in a list of tasks. But alongside those lists, you've also got collaborative documents, which is akin to Google Docs. And you've also got a chat function, which can be akin to Slack. And then all of this is tracked with a Git backend. And so you have version control on all of these things, and you can check what's been done in the past. And so I actually think that the tracking problem has already been solved with this new variety of workspace. And so really all that remains is to figure out some kind of way to determine a community valuation of different tasks and contributions that someone might make. And so if we were able to solve that problem, what this could lead to is a kind of decentralized job board. So for those of you more familiar with coding, you might have heard of bug bounties. And this is the idea that someone can post an issue on GitHub and attach some dollar value to it, which anyone in the world can then come along and go, yep, I can do that problem, solve the problem, and then get rewarded with the bounty. So if we could create this kind of like community-based valuation structure, we could create a similar sort of job board, but it could be decentralized in the sense that you don't need a single project lead determining what the value of a task is, because the community can do that through this process that we develop. And the vision for this is that over time, as people complete these tasks, they add value to the collective effort, and that value gets recognized by the community. Over time, this can equate or turn into a reputation score for each individual person. And ultimately, what that means then is that you have this hierarchy that could emerge naturally through the crowd valuation of effort, such that you then have this hierarchical top-down structure based on the sort of bottom-up valuation of processes of value that people have added over time. And so I think what this could actually be is an efficient merging of the top-down and bottom-up management styles that as far as I know, hasn't been developed yet, and I think could be actually an optimal blend, taking the best benefits of both of those two different styles. And as I touched on before, but really want to highlight, the key point in this whole process that I'm proposing is that it would be dynamic and responsive to research that we could conduct on the system. So this means that as we develop the system, we're constantly iterating, constantly doing A/B testing and finding out the best way to do things. So discovering, how do we control for bias? How do we overcome gaming, and so forth? And through this collective knowledge, this becomes then like a sort of a process knowledge set for how to organize the system in the future. So progress to date. Back in November, so 2 short months ago, we had a pilot test for this concept, which was actually a festival that I threw for my birthday. And through running this festival, I used this ClickUp platform and basically kept a template of all of the tasks that went into creating this festival. And the cool thing now is that recreating that task set, which is fully open and accessible by anyone, is now just a simple matter of clicking duplicate and adding any extra tasks that we want to do for the next festival. So this becomes a way. Yes?
Sorry, I'll just jump in. There's a question in the chat that says, what do you mean by hierarchy in this case? And I think that's probably relevant to the last slide.
Yes, really good question. Yeah, thank you for checking that. So what I mean by that is, like normally in an organization, you might have positions of power that people have been appointed by some kind of top-down mechanism. So you might have, you know, managers, sub-managers, and so forth. What I'm proposing here is that through this crowd-based valuation process, people could develop a reputation score that reflects the value that they've contributed over time. So if someone consistently provides high value over time, then this could be converted into a kind of reputation score that might be some number within the system that represents on a sort of approximate relative level how much value they've added to the organization over time. And this means that those people could have like more of a say in how the organization gets run. So there's various ways you could do this, but one way could be like with a kind of voting mechanism where those people who have a higher reputation get more of a say in how the organization moves forward. So there might be like a distributed voting mechanism where everybody gets to vote, but it's weighted according to someone's reputation score. Hopefully that explains things. I can touch again on that later if it's not clear.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks, Cooper.
Cool. Thanks, Josh. And thanks for the question. So we had this pilot test that was a sort of, pilot test of this concept for this new festival that I want to create. And basically it was kind of a merging of science and spirituality concepts, things that I know from my own personal experience can benefit one another. But also as a test of this idea of creating a new kind of way to share knowledge and create, estimate the community valuation of contributions. And so following the festival in which lots of my friends created, collaborated and contributed lots of amazing things like meditation workshops, DJ sets, some friends even built an effigy, which was like visual map, and then we burned at the end of the day. But basically all of these things I'm seeing as contributions. And then after the festival, I gave everybody a survey to complete, which basically gave them a pool of gratitude tokens. And they were asked to share these gratitude tokens amongst all of those contributions that they found valuable over the weekend. And the key point is that I did an A/B test. So there were two different survey versions. One of them had a pre-filled list of all of the contributions. And then the other version was just a blank slate, asking people to put in whatever contributions they remembered. And so there's some hypotheses that I'm still collecting data on, so I haven't actually tested yet. But the main hypotheses are that giving people a pre-filled survey with all of the contributions will produce fairer results, but will also constrain their distribution because a blank slate allows people to be a lot more creative and think of whatever comes to their mind at the time. Okay, so that's where we're at. I guess the next steps that we're moving into now is, I think what we're developing here is a festival management toolkit. So like I said, I've already got this task-based structure for how Cooperpalooza was organized. That can then be replicated for our next festival or really any other festival that wants to replicate that same structure. And then once we get these community valuations into how each of those tasks were valued, then we have this kind of beginning of a decentralized management template that could be applied to other festivals. And so my hunch is that, well, what I know from talking with a lot of festival organizers is that there's a whole lot of burnout. There's really poor retention because typically what happens is the work that people put in isn't properly appreciated. Lots of volunteers just don't turn up or don't do the job that they're actually expected to do. And this puts pressure on the system and it explodes somewhere, usually in the volunteer coordinator quitting and so forth. And ultimately, this is bad for the organization because they lose all of those important skills that they've built up over time and costs the whole organization a whole bunch of time and money that could otherwise be avoided if they had a more efficient way to organize their festival. And so I think what I've chanced upon here is actually my first customer. I'm an entrepreneur in inverted commas that's been searching for a first customer and product for probably 3 years now. And I think I've actually found it because I think that from discussions with festival organizers already, there's a market for selling something like this to help festival organizers organize their volunteers in particular. And because this will be saving them time and money, this then can convert to some kind of fee, which is a fraction of the money that we save them that can then be fed back into the project. And so just to highlight this, I've just started discussions with Modifier, which is like the local version of Burning Man. And they're right now crying out for something like this. They already, before I came along, had been saying that they're planning to move to a sort of more task-based structure. And so it seems like they're actually already looking for a platform like this. And so I think there's going to be a good synergy there moving forward. And so the full modifier is Open Heart and Mind Festival. And so I just wanted to give you a quick overview of what it is we're creating, and then also invite people to be involved if you're interested. So this is the new concept for a festival that I dreamed up. And the main idea is to be a arts, science, and wellbeing festival that can bring people with potentially different ideas and different backgrounds together, but come to some kind of a shared understanding, excuse me, share knowledge, and hopefully work together to build a more sustainable future together. And so the principles that it's based on are also are the Burning Man principles. The chief one among them is that it's a gift-based festival. And so the main idea is that basically no one has to pay if they don't want to, but instead of offering tickets, we have invites, and invites are extended through this novel application review and selection process. And so the way it works is that people that want to turn up, that want to be involved, can propose offerings across 6 different categories. So those are art, music, science, wellbeing, service, and money. And then we have this transparent, replicable review process where reviewers in the community allocate tokens, which we're calling omnoms, according to different criteria. And so for the crypto nerds out there, we're using quadratic voting, but I can explain what this is later in the question time if people want to know about that. But then there's also this secondary review process where the reviewers, where a select number of reviewers will make sure that there's minimal bias within the review set, but also then try to balance across these different fields on the understanding that it takes the right combination of art, music, money, and so on to actually create a festival. And if you've got too much of one category, then the value of that category actually decreases because you've already got more than enough for what you need. And we're also through this process allocating omnoms for other sources of value to the community. So one thing we're really interested in is making sure that we have diversity and representation from groups that would traditionally be underrepresented or disadvantaged. And then also rewarding other tasks that people put into the project. So, you know, promotions or building things in the lead up and so forth, or referring their friends and getting other people involved, all of which is valuable to the project. And so ultimately what this whole application and review process results in is a sort of leaderboard of omnoms that have been allocated to people, which are intended to approximate the value that they're offering to the community. And then because we have a site capacity of 150 people, we're simply going to take the top 150 people on that leaderboard and they will get invited to this event. But those people who unfortunately miss out will still get to keep their omnoms and then be able to use them to go towards their next application for the next event, which will be in October and then so forth into the future. And I'm still figuring out what the questions we'll test with this review process, but my current leading idea is to test the idea of how pre-existing reviews will bias review scores. And I think this is interesting because all of the post-publication peer review models out there propose that we can just review things in a dynamic, ongoing fashion. But it's an interesting question to know whether pre-existing review scores will bias future review scores. And so that's something that we could potentially test here, but super keen to hear other ideas if people think I'm making more fundamental assumptions here that could be tested. And just finally, the future vision for this project is to look beyond festivals. So obviously I'm interested in validating this model first, but then once we've got a sufficient data set, we can use that as an argument to academics to trial this in their own systems. But beyond academia, I'm also looking to broader business, including distributed autonomous organizations in the crypto space, because what they don't have right now, I think, is an effective way to guide their direction. And I think what we're creating here, this kind of decentralized task-based management structure, could be really pivotal in helping these organizations disrupt a whole bunch of other industries. And so potentially, if we do expand to other markets and start to get lots of businesses interested in using our platform, then we could potentially charge them a tiered subscription fee based on how closely they align with our roadmap and mission. And so the way this would work potentially is that each project that wants to onboard could be rated by our community. And this could be things that are important to us, like transparency, adherence to science, and so forth. And then we could charge each organization a different fee based on how well they got rated, basically. So this would mean ultimately that those organizations or projects that are really aligned with our mission could use our platform for free. And effectively we merge and collaborate, because now we're getting data that's really useful and they're getting a more efficient way to organize their project. But then also it gives less aligned projects a clear avenue to either reduce their fees, which is good for the general mission because they might become more transparent or more scientific and so forth, or alternatively they can keep paying big dollars, which gets fed back into our mission aligned project, and that's kind of a win-win for us either way. Okay, so that's kind of the end. Here's some more literature you can check out. So if you're interested in any of this, check out any of these links, and they should all have links to the other documents. But we also have a Facebook group where you can get involved. But yeah, most of the documentation is on our ClickUp space, which is probably the best entry point is on tiny.cc/readme. Thanks very much.